my prep for this sermon felt a little bit strange. Although, to be honest with you, I feel like the last several months, it's been so varied that I don't know that I have a kind of baseline normative experience anymore. But it was unusual in that what I felt like I actually ended up with was probably, I'm going to say at least two, probably at least three different sermons. Like I had separate notes even. Like I had a handwritten set that went a certain direction. I had a typed set that went another direction. And then I had another set in the margins of the bulletin this morning at New Covenant that went in a different direction. And then this morning, I didn't preach at New Covenant, but a friend, Abigail Spears, preached and just did a beautiful job. And it was so moving, and it was tempting to just think I maybe just need to offer this to St. Mary's. And then on the way home, so you may notice Katie and the boys aren't here. They're passing around a cold. Thank you to the Petri dish that is daycare. But on the way home, the drive was quite a bit quieter than usual, and so I listened to Bishop Chris's sermon that he preached at Divine Life. He's in Oklahoma City this weekend. They all are. And at a church there. And then I also listened to the sermon from our sister church, one of our sister churches, Sanctuary in Tulsa, and Father Paul Pano's. All of these sermons were just like terrific. Of course, there's commonality. We're all using the same text for today. But they were great, and it all left me pretty confused. In the best of ways, like confused and overwhelmed in the ways that, like, you know, when you go and have that very special meal, whatever that looks like, and there's just this unbelievable amount of wonderful food, and you're kind of overwhelmed, like, I want to eat it all at once, like right now, you know, and you can't, and you don't even know sort of where to start. And that's kind of how I feel about this. And so I'll just say this: no matter how many sermons I preach tonight, my commitment to you is that they will all fit within the time frame of a single sermon. So the other feeling that I had about what I want to share tonight is that I don't need to grasp at it too tightly. And I'm not entirely sure about that, but if nothing else, it kind of made me stop manuscripting for tonight, the sermon, which was tough, because that's what I want to do, especially when I feel like there's so much. Where do I need to go with this? I tend to just want to manuscript it all out. But I didn't do that. So I think I'll begin with the Gospel of Mark. What we just read together, what we just heard. Jesus speaks of his own betrayal, death, and resurrection, right? He's telling his disciples. The pace of Mark is wild and wonderful, and I just love it. It's so fun. And Mark tells us they didn't understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him, which I think is funny. And I get it. The disciples lack understanding. This is, of course, a theme that's really played up in Mark. I mean, in Mark, they just don't stand a chance. And you know, we can't get too haughty because, I mean, we're them on our best days. But they have a hard time knowing how to receive Jesus' words here. And I would say it like this: they have a hard time knowing how to receive Jesus. I mean, this is a theme over and again in the disciples. How do we take you, Lord? Think about last week, right? Peter confesses, Jesus, you are the Messiah, but because he can't yet receive all that Messiahship entails, he quickly rebukes Jesus. They have a hard time receiving Jesus and all that it means to receive him as he is, not as someone else, not as their projections of Messiah, or a teacher, but as him, who he is. They're not alone. We have a hard time receiving Jesus. Christ comes to us. I think, I have a sense of there's so few of us out. I may not would say this on another night, but I have a sense kind of us here, and my guess is that probably all of us can say like, yeah, I get that. Like I have a hard time receiving Jesus. Christ comes in strange ways sometimes, shows up in unexpected places, speaks to me in ways that, quite frankly, sometimes I'd rather not be spoken to, in humble ways, in quiet ways. Maybe most challenging of all, it feels sometimes Jesus speaks to us through people who we would really prefer not to hear Jesus through if we had our druthers about it. If you lived with Christ at all, you know it can be challenging to have his home made in you. Again, I think about the passage from last week. Pick up your cross. Follow after me. Yeah. Jesus tells his disciples what's going to happen, and they don't understand. This morning, Abigail made this in her sermon. She made this wonderful point that I don't know why I'd never even considered this before, but she said, what if Jesus was hoping that he might receive some comfort from his friends? I'm going to be betrayed, and that is going to get me killed. I'm going to be raised again. And their response? Nothing. I just think, what terrible friends. And at this point, again, I really relate. I mean, maybe because I have some friends like that, but maybe because more often than not, I feel like that friend. Something drops and you're like, gosh, see you later. I don't know quite how to always inhabit that space. At least maybe a kind of, hey, we're with you. We don't get it, but we're with you. But that doesn't happen. Sorry, Jesus. What we find quickly is that the disciples are still trying to make the world as they see fit. They're living in that way, with an unfaithful preoccupation for us of either the past or the future. It makes being in the present impossible. Again, all of us here are old enough to have those feelings and recognize that sense. The sense that I need to make the world around me in a certain way. I need to fashion it. I mean, for some of us, that feels large, but it can be as small as, I need this relationship to look in a certain way. And I'm going to bend it to look like that. It can have to do with our vocation, with the shapes of our lives, with our families, the shape of their lives. We're tempted with that in our churches. I'm reminded of the line from Bonhoeffer, God hates visionary dreaming. He's speaking of churches and our life together. He says, because if you live in visionary dreaming in community with your brothers and sisters in Christ, you will ensure that it will not be what it needs to be, because you don't know all that it needs to be. He warns them about living that way in the church, bending the world around us to our will, or at least trying to. That can look like a kind of preoccupation with the future. It can look like an anxiety about the future. This needs to be something. I mean, you've got to know that's a temptation with a new church like this. Oh, this needs to be something. And most of us who are here probably don't feel too much pressure about things like it needs to be a certain number of people, and that's wonderful. but there's other pitfalls we can just as easily fall into. It can look like anxiety. It can look like fear. It can look like being hung up on the past, unable to leave these places, whether it be of pain or of difficulty. But whatever it is, it makes it so that when Jesus speaks and gives himself to us, we're silent. We have nothing to say, unable to be present. So they arrive at Capernaum, and Jesus wants to know what they were arguing about while traveling. As he's telling them what he's going to have to endure. So they're silent at first. They don't say anything. They're afraid. But then as they're walking along, apparently Jesus does hear them talking. And so he says to them, "What were you talking about?" And the text says they were silent. Again, this is, at least they're consistent, right? He tells them what's going to happen, they're silent. He asks them, "What were you saying, though, later on? You remember after I told you I was going to have to die?" And they're silent. They're not going to say anything again. So Mark cues us in on it. He's like, well, here's what they were talking about. They were arguing about who was the greatest among them. And at that point, maybe they thought to themselves, well, he did say he was going to die, so we got to figure out who's going to rise up in the ranks. So Jesus says, look, whoever wants to be first has to be last of all and servant of all. He makes this point by bringing a child into their midst and holding the child in his arms. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. There's a lot that I could say here. This was in another one of the sermons, but something along the lines of, it never ceases to amaze me that Jesus is such I want to say this in the right way, but he's just so consistently such a safe place for the people who are the least. I don't mean safe in that he's predictable or manageable, but I mean safe that, he's, let's say it like this, trustworthy. They're in a house in Capernaum, maybe Peter's mother-in-law's home. But if you've got children around ancient Near East, it's because you had women around. There were people who followed him. He was trustworthy. He could be trusted. They're arguing about power, the disciples. They're about greatness, about honor. And Jesus brings a child to them. Since you're here, Sean, I'll include some Stanley Hauerwas. About this point, Hauerwas says, bringing a child into the picture can result in sentimental versions of Jesus' work that betray the hardness of the kingdom. There is nothing sentimental about the demands that Jesus places on those able to receive this child. And there's nothing sentimental about children. There is for us. We get all kinds of sentimental, but Jesus picks a child because children were servants. They were the least. They had no standing. I don't know if you remember this passage in Galatians, that how Paul talks about a child, even an heir, so long as they're a child, is no different than a slave. Jesus makes the same point here. This is why he's setting a child among them and taking this child into his arms. You have to be a slave of all. This isn't common sense. This isn't getting ahead. This isn't accruing status or wealth or even a way to grow a church. Jesus wants to free them. So he says, be a slave to all, like this child. Don't only give up your standing, but wash the feet of others. Think back to the passage in James For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will be disorder and wickedness of every kind. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war with you? And you covet something and cannot obtain it? So you engage in disputes and conflicts. You don't have because you don't ask, and you ask and don't receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Jesus lays bare the earthly wisdom, to use James' language, the unspiritual, the devilish wisdom, he'll say. That's at work here in the disciples. Look, you guys are clamoring, you're arguing, and even if you want something that's good, you want to be, if we wanted to try to have a really generous read in that, be the greatest in the kingdom in all the wonderful ways that might mean, you don't want it in the right ways. So you ask wrongly. So why a child? Why must they be able to welcome a child? Well, a child can do nothing for you. They're not useful. And neither is God. God is not useful. There is this inutility that's at work. They have to be able to welcome a child in their midst, because if you cannot welcome a child, you will not be able to welcome Jesus. I think about what Paul says in that famous Christ hymn in Philippians 2. Let this mind be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, assuming human likeness, and being found in appearance as a human, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Look, if you can't receive the least of these, you cannot receive Jesus, because that's who he is. Of course, he has to take on the form of a slave, because the form of a king or a ruler is too small for this Lord. Paul, why do you persecute me? Jesus is with the least of these. So if we don't know how to receive those who are of no use to us, we will not have any idea of how to receive Jesus. If we cannot see them and love them and recognize just the inherent value that they are for just by virtue of existing and being them, we won't be able to receive Jesus. In that passage in James, he talks about gentleness born of wisdom. I'll come back to that in just a second. In our proverb today, 31, I could feel a few of you kind of grinning when you realized what we were reading. A text, I don't think I have to say this here, but a text, like any text of Scripture, should not be weaponized against one another. Certainly not in misogynistic ways. I mean, which there's all kinds of silliness about that way of interpretation, not least of which is there is only one instruction given in what we read. And did you notice who it was directed to? Not the woman. But of course, in Proverbs, wisdom is personified as a lady. And there's all kinds of ways to read this, including like the church, the bride of Christ. There's all sorts of interesting things my friend Paul got into this morning that were so much fun. And if we had more time, maybe we would do it. Like the language that's used describing this woman only shows up one other place, and it's for Ruth, who doesn't fit any of these molds. So maybe it's not as wooden as we would have thought. But another sermon for another time. Or just go listen to the one from Sanctuary. It was wonderful. In Bishop Chris's sermon this morning, he drew out this line. I love this thought. He said he was arrested by that line towards the end of the chapter. She laughs at the days ahead. She laughs at the days ahead. And I think about that, and I think about James' words of the gentleness that is born of wisdom. Laughing at the days ahead, not because we're ignorant or we are naive, not because we're out of touch with the way things go in the world, or because we're looking through rose-colored glasses. No. To see the world clearly, to see it as it is, but to be able to laugh at the days ahead because of Christ, because we trust in the faithfulness of the Lord. Psalm 1, the wicked are blown like chaff. They're blown like chaff to and fro. Let's say it like this. The unwise are blown around like chaff. They can't laugh at the days ahead, because the days ahead represent threat and concern. They represent a future that they have to make for themselves. And so when things don't pan out the way that we want, we get blown around, tossed to and fro. Do you ever feel like that in life, that you're kind of living just from one crisis point to another? And sort of everything and who you are sort of hinges on, oh, dear God, what's going to happen next month? They're blown around like chaff, but the psalmist says, I delight in the law of the Lord. This is something of the gentleness that is born of wisdom, an ability to delight, an ability to know delight, not just to know, yes, to know delight in the law of the Lord, to recognize that the law of the Lord is freedom, it is liberation, it is an unburdensome burden. But to be able to experience delight, it takes a kind of being present to be brought into delight. To be surprised by the world around you, to live into wonder. I want to be careful about drawing too tight of parallels, but I can't, since we have a toddler and a newborn, I kind of can't help but think of them. One of our friends this weekend gave our son one of these little expandable tunnels. Thanks, But it is really cute, and it's wonderful. And I came in his room this afternoon, and Katie was in there with him, and I was just getting ready to leave to come here, and they had taken it out, and it was expanded across the whole length of his room. And I said, Ollie, you got a tunnel. And he whipped around, and he just started laughing, just giddy, and ran to it. We need to grow down into childlikeness, to be present enough to be filled with wonder, to recognize the wonder that is there, to be surprised by delight. Think about those moments of love and romance when you just feel such delight that you're beside yourself. Gentleness. The gentleness that is born of wisdom is a gentleness that rests deeply within us. You know this kind of gentleness when you're under pressure. Again, my kids, I said a good thing, now let me say something that was, we were driving home yesterday after being with family, and Ollie decided that now, after a long day, now was the time to scream as loud as he could for as long as he could. And I said, Ollie, you have got to stop, son. And it's like I didn't say a word. That kind of pressure, when silly story, right? But let's make it something very real. Loss of job. Falling apart of a meaningful and deep relationship. Tragic loss. Death happening around us. pressures that are put on us, can we respond in gentleness to those around us and to ourselves in the midst of that? This is the gentleness that is born of wisdom, and that kind of gentleness is an astounding strength. All right, I promise to keep it within the sermon, the time of one sermon. I didn't say whose, though, maybe like Bishop Chris's sermon times. One of my favorite stories that I've ever heard, years ago I heard someone, and they were at this conference and some kind of huge sort of symposium type thing, and while they were there, he was able to be kind of backstage and in the waiting area, and there were two people of pretty amazing renown who were there. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, South African Archbishop, if you're aware of him, and the Dalai Lama. And they're friends. They were friends, and he sees them and he's thinking, wow, I mean, this is basically like Gandalf and I don't know who else, of just incredible wisdom and just that kind of deep sort of elemental something, gravitas that's there, and like, what are they going to do? And he's kind of watching them and looking. And as he's watching and just sort of seeing how they're going to interact with each other, they start, like one of them reaches over and he realizes, did he just tickle him? And they start giggling like little kids, tickling each other and laughing about it, and then they're laughing about it. But if you know anything about their stories, both the Dalai Lama and his kind of harrowing story to survive, and then Archbishop Desmond Tutu and all that he has to live through and is a part of, and the kind of the reconciliation that happens, reconciliatory work, I should say, that happens after the apartheid in South Africa. You know, these have been remarkably kind of insane lives, filled with unbelievable pressures. But here they are, laughing, experiencing delight. Gentleness that's born of wisdom. Wisdom that delights in the law of the Lord, meditating on it day and night. I don't know if this language was given to me. I don't know. It feels inspired no matter what, in that it feels like poetry, but it also is, it's hard for me to define, but I can feel around it that these two words. It came to me years ago when I was writing a letter to my wife, actually, and I talked about love's wisdom. Love's wisdom. Again, I don't quite know how to define that in some kind of solid way, but it hits me like poetry. I wish I was a poet and I could try to speak to this, and maybe I would have a poem for you. But love's wisdom that leads us into gentleness, that allows us to pause and slow down and delight, that enables us to be present. What do we have time for? To love, to receive, to care, to be present to those around us, especially those who are the least useful to us. Last week I told you I commented and quoted that line from Irenaeus, the glory of God is in the human person fully alive. But the other half of that is, and the life of the human is the beholding of God, the vision of God. What I hear Jesus asking of his disciples is that, behold, look with your hearts open. Look with your guards down. Behold, take in, be present. I hesitate to even say present because I think it's become such a cliche for us. Be here in trust of me. So I think this is a word for each of us a good word, and I think it's good because I trust God will just keep coming to us and working with us until we know how to receive him in our midst. But I also think, and this is what I'll end with, that this is a word for St. Mary's. Jesus sets a child in their midst and says, you've got to welcome this one. But of course, Mary does welcome a child in her own body, the Messiah. A child who, like all babies, could do nothing for her, but also she was told, because of this child, a sword will pierce your heart. So here's my kind of holy suspicion and hope. I think that God is making us into the kind of church that learns, loves wisdom. Gentle people who can welcome children in the name of the Lord. And yes, because of love, a people whose heart will be pierced. But like Mary, a heart that will not be shattered, even in its piercing. Amen.